All right. Welcome to number 2 of questions for my cultural history of the United States of America. Once again, Jeremy is with me, and he's collated some of the questions that have come in, which I appreciate very much. Keep those coming. And he's going to ask them, and I'll see what I can do to add clarity or nuance or correction or whatever is asked for. So, without further ado, Jeremy.
All right. Good evening, Wes. Question 1 is from Mostly Just Lost. And this person asks, much of what you're saying seems to apply to all the Anglo-colonial societies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. I once read a historical quote by a Maori man saying that being asked to assimilate into white society was like being asked to assimilate into a cultural nothingness. So are the other colonial societies in America similar, or are they completely different, or is this something that can be projected onto all kinds of colonial societies?
So the patterns in colonial societies are, because there's so many of them for so long, it's they're wildly divergent, and because the circumstances are so divergent. While it is a common pattern that the U.S. had, aspects of it are common, aspects of it are completely uncommon, which is what we're just exploring in the series in part. For instance, just as an example, in Peru, colonized by Spain, today there's still 26% or so of the population speak one of the two major native languages of Peru, and the vast majority of those people, these are estimates, around 20% of them speak it as their only language. So this would be, imagine if, what would that work out in the United States? It'd be as if there were 75 million Americans who only spoke one of a couple of Native American dialects, right, or languages. So the notion that large contingents of the culture of the natives people can survive is certainly there. That happens in a lot of places. But other places is completely wiped, like in Brazil, like it's Portuguese or nothing, right? So again, the diversity is very great. And it also depends on what you're looking at, cultural maintenance, survival of the indigenous populations, because a lot of countries have large indigenous populations that have survived relatively intact, but they've been urbanized and incorporated in a mainstream society. So the absorption has kind of gone the other direction. A counter example from North America would be the French trappers and traders, who I mentioned in the video, I think, who were in the United States for about, well, what would become Canada and the U.S., North America, for about 200 years. And they really had a habit of living with, marrying, having kids with, and setting up mixed societies that mostly followed, when you got out of like Quebec and Montreal, the trade cities, mostly followed Native American culture. So it was it kind of, they got assimilated the other direction. So, and that went on for 200 years. So it wasn't like, oh, for 10 years, they kind of mixed and then everything fell apart. So really the impact of colonial expansion is highly variable, and also depends what you look at historically. So I was thinking about this, and one of the examples that popped in my head was the Scandinavian Vikings came into France around 800 or 900. I should have looked up the dates. They say 800, and wreaked a bunch of havoc, and they came back and wreaked some more havoc, and eventually they settled in what is today Normandy, hence Normandy, the name, and they went on to invade England, and create havoc in England, and they got absorbed or changed, or like so. Right, what happened with those cultures, right? So they didn't totally dominate either statistically, numerically, or with power, and eventually just got absorbed. And that happens a lot of places where small or even large incursions simply get absorbed, like the Mongols in China. Really large incursion, slowly get absorbed. So yeah, so I would say there's a wide diversity, but it is not atypical of settlements in the New World in Africa.
Okay. Second question has to do with states in the United States that do seem to identify with a country or a colonial power. So specifically about Louisiana. Louisiana seems to strongly identify with either France or Spain. How is that different or specifically unique in the American experience, where the kind of subject of your series is that maybe we don't have a cultural center?
Yeah, so I think Louisiana is a great. I have a whole episode on Louisiana coming up, so I don't want to give too much away. But I think one example is, this is the power of New Orleans. Say what you want about New Orleans, everybody said the same thing. It's very different, right? It was this very unique city in America because it had the deep French and Spanish roots. The people tended to be, before the floods, unfortunately, but that was one of the things that really destroyed the fabric of New Orleans. People in New Orleans tended to stay in New Orleans and tended to live in the same places for generations.
Okay.
And so it was divergent from the normal development history of American cities and areas. And so this is why I want to use it as sort of like a foil that highlights both what is and isn't true. And examples like Louisiana do highlight how incredibly diverse the United States is, and what a large place it is. But one way to think about this is not that Louisiana is different. It's that because of its peculiar history, and the French presence being there for so long, and the Spanish presence being there for so long, that some of the impacts of the patterns of British and the traditions of American settlement and development are less emphasized there. But as we go through that episode, I think you'll see that less emphasized is not emphasized. And in some ways, it ends up being the perfect sort of little cauldron for what it means to be an American today, which is why I want to do a whole episode on that. Another counterexample to this would also be Virginia, which was the first colony. And it's interesting that people almost always talk about the Puritans coming, right? Like, this is the beginning. It's like, no, it was Virginia, right? The people don't want to talk about Virginia for some reason. I have my suspicions historically. When you studied in school, didn't they talk? Oh, the first colonists came over and settled in Plymouth, right? Is that what you got?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, they were about 50 years after again, dates. I'm so bad with dates. I think it was 40 years. I think it was 1620 for Virginia and 1660 for Plymouth, something like this. But anyway, it was a good run. Virginia had been around, having all kinds of problems, starving to death, fighting with the natives, getting new governors at a fair clip, long before the Puritans showed up. But we don't like to talk about Virginia. And so this is why, however, the pattern in the South is, again, slightly, not hugely, but the emphasis is different. And I always like to talk about literature, of course. And if there's a short story by Faulkner or Fitzgerald, I should look. Faulkner, it must be Faulkner. Anyway, it's called Ice House. Short story called Ice House, in which a young Southern woman marries a wealthy Northern industrialist guy. And it's a brilliant short story because in just a few months, she goes from being in the South to being in the North, and at the end, she's back in the South. It just explores the different the different feelings of the regions of the United States. So I do not want to imply that there is no regional diversity in the United States. There absolutely is, but it is played out against this peculiar backdrop that impacts the way that diversity is expressed. So yes, I don't know if that's an answer. That's a ramble. How about that?
Yeah, that's fine. Thomas has a question about English culture in America. His example was from a documentary where the musician Sting is coming through New York and noticing all the Irish pubs, and asks the question, where are all the English pubs? Why are there so few English pubs compared with Irish pubs? And the taxi driver kind of rolls his eyes and says, well, those have all become American pubs because England is the predominant American cultural, influence. And so what about this idea that America does have a predominant kind of center, and that's England?
On one hand, absolutely, the importance of English settlers and governance it is incredibly powerful in American history. You can't get that wrong. So, for instance, we had England was governing the New World that became the United States for what, let's see, 150, 160 years before the Revolutionary War breaks out. We ally ourselves with France, fight the Revolutionary War, win, and immediately ally ourselves with England. Right? Like we're like, okay, let's be clear, fuck the French, right? Like we know who our real friends are. Our real friends are the English. A, they're not Catholic, and B, they're not French. So that is so. I think just little moments like that in American history, you're like, oh yeah, we really, really strongly identify with that English heritage, and hence English pubs become American bars. However, the problem with that is to think that there is some continuity that makes the American settlement like other English colonial settlements. Because one, there's a huge diversity in English colonial settlements. Two, it just never worked the way many other English colonies did. So for long time in India, there was this British ruling class that would come and go, and they'd migrate back and forth between England and all of this. So there was that reciprocal influence. In the United States, it was not 100%, but mostly you come, you leave, you enter this new sort of vast land. And so the culture just starts to morph because the example that I think is the clearest is the land in England was all owned and divided. Like one of the big drivers of people wanting to come to the United States was, look, you could get land. Like this is like an impossibility in England at the time. Like the land was owned. You had the whole, earlier, but you have the whole enclosure movement where peasants were being kicked off their land because landowners wanted to graze sheep because of wool export and all this was so, wool became so valuable in manufacturing and all this. And so vast areas were just denuded of people as they're being kicked off of land that they had been tenant farmers on for sometimes, time. They didn't even know how long they'd been there, just forever, basically. And so the notion of land and being available amongst other ones it just changes everything. Like the English culture as known by people coming from England, coming to a place where land is available is just, it's really different. And by the way, the enclosure movement is so extreme that in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland, they estimate that the population today is not greater than it was before the enclosure movement began, like 200 years ago, 300 years ago. That's how many people were just moved off, right? Just you're gone, starving, shifted. So there's so many differences. And because there was so little bilateral exchange, it was really mostly one way, lots of trade, but it was mostly a one way. Having said all that, again, if you read like Henry James or anything, the literate and ruling classes tended to look back to England. Like that's where they compared themselves to. When they made money, that's where they went. When in the late 1800s, wealthy Americans wanted to go to England and marry, small nobility, so that would raise the sort of prestige of the family, and lots of money went that way. But overall, it was mostly a one-way flow.
Right. So the kind of intellectual classes did have this back and forth that some of the other British settlement or colonies would have in all kinds of classes going back and forth, or work, or more like the bourgeois class would go back and forth in other colonies, whereas in America it was mostly this kind of intellectual class going back and forth.
Yeah, and particularly since there was no ruling caste of British lords here for very long, right? There wasn't a huge British officialdom. There never was. There was always a very small cadre of actual British, I guess, citizens, if you want to think of them that way, but basically representatives of the British government in the U.S. Okay. And it was only, and then that got, obviously, with the Revolutionary War, exterminated. So they all had to leave. The war was lost. And so it just didn't make the same kind of imprint. They didn't have the opportunity to make the same structural and cultural forms on top of the people who were here. And again, as I mentioned last time, you had New Amsterdam, which is primarily Dutch colonists. You had the Swiss colonists. You had French and Spanish colonists. You had the Native Americans. So there were all these other forces that it took, 100 years after the revolution to get settled.
Mhm.
And so while, yes, vitally important, and again, if you read the Albion Seed, I think is the best book I know of on this, where he tracks this out very distinctly from different parts of England to different parts of America. And yet, I think in this case, the differences are also vastly important.
Okay. Yeah, and Thomas has a sort of second part to this question in the second paragraph that suggests to be an unquestionable American is to be white Anglo-Protestant. Everyone knows of the Plymouth Brethren and the Founding Fathers amongst our famous American people in history, and they all had English surnames. It sounds like he was pretty passionate about that part of it. And he's kind of pushing back against the central thesis of your series, I think, in that. And what are your thoughts just in general about that kind of idea that we do have a culture and we should just accept that it's this kind of dominant white Anglo-Protestant culture?
Well, that the people who came to dominate were primarily white Anglo-Saxon Protestant is pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that part is not much to argue with there. In fact, one reason they didn't like the French is because they were Catholic. During the Revolutionary War, they tried to get Canada to join the fight with with the colonies against England, and but Quebec, which was theoretically part of England, had been given the rights to be Catholic and the right to use French and the right to basically do what they want, as long as they just sort of played along and didn't fight anymore. And this really pissed the colonists off, particularly the Catholic thing. And for their part, the people in Quebec were give or take, they said, oh, so what you have is a British colony fighting the British government. For us, this is a total win, right? Like, we're just going to sit back and watch this because, we don't really feel like we have a big dog in this fight. And then when we invaded, when the colonies invaded, things shifted a bit. But originally, they were like, yeah, we don't care. You guys knock yourselves off, but we certainly aren't fighting. But we didn't like them because they were Catholic. So the nuance here is important, though. One is, just because you're born white doesn't give you a culture. It gives you a skin color. It doesn't give you a culture. Protestantism will be hugely important because of the influence of Calvin. Much about Calvin coming on and shaping that. But it's a Calvinism and a Protestantism that often would not be recognized back in the countries from which it was theoretically sprung. Mm-hmm. Anglo-Saxon, I mean, this is where you get into these problematic, hereditary problems, right? Like, what the hell does it mean to be Anglo-Saxon? If you come from England, are you Anglo-Saxon? Because the Saxons invaded England these many years. The Normans, right? Does that make you Anglo? Are the French Anglo-Saxon? What about the Spanish? They're probably not Anglo-Saxon because they're Catholic, right? And so that's certainly grossly exaggerated, right? So and even whiteness, right? The concept, which is bothersome, of course, which is a crazy concept. Anyway, I've got a whole thing on race about how silly this concept is. But originally, Irish people were not considered white, nor were Italians. And so, no, like those people aren't white, so they don't count. And so that notion of what it means to be white Anglo-Saxon has shifted pretty dramatically as we moved around the continents. And part of it is when you're in, say, New York, and you're in Brooklyn, let's say, and there's a neighborhood that's almost entirely Irish and the next door neighbors are almost entirely Italian, wow, you really feel the difference and the cultural continuity. Mm-hmm. When some of those people head off on the Oregon Trail and settle in, I don't know, Oregon or California or something, all of a sudden those big vast differences seem really, really small because you're out there alone in the middle of nothing, trekking along. Right. It's like, yeah, we all got to get along. And so we're just going to pretend like all these differences that we felt back in the home countries don't really apply anymore.
Mhm.
And so I think really the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant concept is very important for trying to shape an American identity. The reality of that underneath is very weak indeed. Mostly you have whiteness and you have Protestantism, but you don't have what I would call like any sense of real Anglo-Saxonness. And
Mhm.
again, this creates the problem, as I mentioned in the last lecture, of what do you do with states like Virginia or Mississippi, West Virginia, that have populations 30, 40, 50% not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Mhm.
And so if you say your country is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, it creates precisely this problem, which is to say, okay, well, what about these 50% of your population? And you go, well, this makes it tricky, right? It creates a problem, right? Because there's a bunch of your country, again, particularly in the South, that's not that.
Right.
And yeah,
Yeah, and it seems like at the core of this series there's a thesis that says that there's some kind of a vacuum of culture that existed initially in America once there were settlers and movement west, and because there was so many people coming, and because there was so much space in the land, that kind of persisted throughout. And I'm going to circle back to the first question again, that says a lot of what you're saying appears to apply to all the Anglo-colonial societies. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, maybe South Africa, this kind of cultural vacuum. But is this unique to America, or is this something that can be kind of projected? When you answered this question initially, you were saying that it's various how this plays out in different colonial societies. But could this kind of the thesis of this series be projected onto other massive white colonial experiences in these other countries?
partly yes, partly no. Australia is a good example because Australia is an incredibly urbanized continent, and the population is heavily, not entirely, because they've had immigration from other countries, but heavily British. Like, wow, so British.
Uh-huh.
And so while it has evolved a different culture over time, the concentration of the people in areas allowed them to sustain many of the patterns that would otherwise have vanished. So they
Mm-hmm.
came over in large groups. They established these groups. They grew in those groups, and so Australia has again evolved a distinct culture, but a distinct culture from very powerful roots.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. came across for different reasons in different places and different geographies, and then continued to expand at this phenomenal rate.
Mm-hmm.
That meant that while if the U.S. was only made up of New York, Boston, you know, Detroit, and maybe Philadelphia, yeah, we would be clearly a British colony, right? We would be the children of the British colony. It would be very clear. The cultural heritage would be distinct and not a problem. But we're not. I mean, that makes up essentially almost none of the United States. And they're important and they have history and they're culturally important, but there's 98% of the rest of stuff going on had nothing to do with that. And
Right.
so it's a big distinction between other colonial settlement patterns and what actually ended up happening in the United States.
Right. Yeah, and with a country like New Zealand, this question is referring to the massive difference between Maori culture and British culture, but New Zealand didn't have that expanse of land and so many different types of people coming to that land to dominate over such a long period of time.
Yeah, yeah. I think one way maybe to think about this just occurs to me is to say you can come to a country and assimilate with the existing culture in some sort of melange and mix. This happens all the time in world history. Has been going on forever. And that creates new cultures or just sort of forms into a different direction over time. That's one thing you can do. You can come to a place and you can exterminate or eliminate or just kick out the existing population and inhabit it with a coherent cultural group with lots of rules and order and hierarchy and laws and patterns. and then that will be very coherent with it'll diverge over time. What happening in the United States is neither of those things happened. Is a not distinct group of people from all over the place came over a long period of time to a geography that was constantly expanding and transmogrifying. And so there was, no, if like I said, if you said, oh yes, just New York, sure, you can find some cultural continuity, more cultural continuity, but it's not just New York. What do you do with Texas, right? What do you do with California or North Dakota or Wisconsin, right? These places where you go, who's been there, how long have they been there, what have they been doing? And
Right.
it's very different. I mean, this is part of one of the problems is it is very different, which I mentioned before, the flyover states, right? Like they don't count. We try to ignore them, even though they're 85% of the land mass of the United States. It's best to not think that they exist.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So that is.
What about Canada? That's such a nuanced kind of question here. I mean, this is a really good question that has, it's kind of like the central question that I picked up on whenever I was reading these, because Canada is so close to us. And would you be able to kind of roll Canada into this series? And it could have been called America and Canada, or North America, or how do you feel about that?
See, what's interesting, I think here's the distinction you can make is, say what you want about Quebec and Quebecois and Montreal and all this, but everybody in Canada and the US who's ever been there will tell you it's different from the rest of Canada, right? Like Montreal and Quebec is a different place, and it's a different place because of its cultural heritage of France and the heavy influence of that. De Gaulle famously, I think in the 60s, came to Quebec and to Montreal and to wild fanfare, right? So that very different cultural sensibility is there. The rest of Canada, I think it's 80 some percent of Canadian population lives within whatever, like 10 miles of the American border, right? Like the US Canadian border is vastly less diverse than the US is, right? So if you look at the diversity statistics of the population of the US and you look at the diversity of Canada, it is very much more homogenous. The only variance is, well, of course, depending on how you want to score Quebec, is you have the very large Chinese or Asian population around Vancouver. But if you look at something like, central northern Canada, it's a lot more like the Midwest of the United States, right? Which you can look at and go, oh yeah, this is very white, heavily English, with a clearer tie and traditions. Which is great for Canada. However, with Canada, that really is what's going on. I mean, you have the North, you still have the native, the first peoples, first people still have a lot of presence there, more than in the United States. But that their coherent culture is more sensible in some ways than the U.S. is, because while the U.S. has that, if the U.S. was just the northern part of the U.S., called, by the way, with the joke in Pacific Northwest, we called it the Great White North, right? Like, as the diversity was low, again, except for Asians because of the Pacific Ocean there. And so, but that's not all of the U.S. The U.S. also has Louisiana, right? Which is this very, very different place indeed. So it's, how do you conceptualize a place that has these pockets of potential coherence, but then also has a lot that just doesn't fall into that. Which reminds me, by the way, back to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant thing. Part of the narrative, again, something we'll be talking about, is what you do in this context is you create narratives. One of the narratives that we've struggled very hard to create in the United States over history is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant narrative. Right? This is why this concept is created, because of, if you are a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, everything's going fine, you don't have that concept. Right? You don't need it. You create that concept when you're like, oh, this is who we are. We need a name for it. English people don't call themselves white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Right? Like this was, I don't think anybody in Sweden calls themselves a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Right? This is a word or a concept that follows on a sense of a lack or loss of identity. And so you try to paper over that lack of identity and sense of loss or confusion with this sort of very soft, crazy, amorphous notion. And by the way, this is everywhere. You can look this up. This is one of the things I like about the history of, history generally, but Harvard and Princeton tried to prevent so many Jews and other unpleasant people from arriving in Harvard and Princeton because to take classes, because they felt like it was making the school unpleasant. They didn't like them. And so this is part of where these SAT tests came from, as they thought, oh, if we create a test that we can use to culturally sort of sieve out the undesirable element, then that'll help. That didn't work so well. And so then they came up with this idea of regional diversity. And this is when they started recruiting people from the Midwest. They started recruiting students from these other areas where they had the populations were more desirable, right? More white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because that's what Harvard and Princeton was all about.
I see.
And so this struggle has been there for a long time, and it's like, oh, what is New York, right? Well, we don't want the Jews, so the Jews don't count, which is crazy, right? If anybody counts in New York, it's got to be the Jewish community must have some sway and some say. But again, Louisiana wouldn't count because they were largely Catholic for a long time, and French and Spanish.
Right.
Texas and New Mexico and Arizona wouldn't count because of the Spanish and Native American presence, right? And so you end up, if you actually tried to promote that as a concept, what you discover is that you end up just crossing out whole vast swaths of the history and territory of the U.S., which is, of course, what we've done. It's why we don't like it's why we don't do history, amongst other reasons. So, yeah.
Right. All right. And then our final question is more of a social question. So do you think that the lack of history in America contributes to alienation and social strife?
Yes, and yes. One of the things I really want to emphasize in this series as we go along, and particularly starting next time, which I think the next episode, which will be on radical American individuality, if you don't have a coherent social narrative to help you understand who you are and how you fit into the world, you feel bad.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's the summation. Short. This is very well studied, perfectly clear, not confusing, not controversial. And so when there is this lack of coherent sense of historical identity, and again, not saying that these histories are all true, by the way, right? Like, historical narratives are used in all kinds of crazy ways, but if you have something that's at least moderately agreed on, or even agreed about what you're going to argue about in the historical context, then this gives people a much better sense of who they are and how they belong. And one of the things that leads to a sense of alienation is when I don't know who you are, because I don't know your history, and you don't know who I am because you don't know my history. How do we fit together? We don't like these strange, weird people. And so it's very tricky, and it creates a lot of this. And by the way, this is, again, not me. This is for, as far as I know, for recorded history, cultures, when they conquered other cultures, really tried to impose. They either just left them alone and said, okay, we're just going to rule. But this is what the Romans did. People talk about Roman conquest. They conquered a lot, but what they generally did, not universally, but generally did, is they just killed like 6 of the elite, put their 6 guys in charge, left everybody else, all the rest of the elite, all the land, they just left it in place. And they said, okay, you guys do you, pay your taxes, and put people in the military, and life will be good. If you don't, we're just going to kill you all. That's one approach. But another very popular approach was to move in and say, all right, we're giving you a new history that starts today. And it's built around Marduk, or it's built around the Pharaoh, or it's built on something that grounds you in a mythological framework, mythopoetic understanding of the universe that gives you a sense of identity, belonging, and, well-being, essentially. And so, yeah, I do think this is one of the problems with the nihilistic sensibilities in the United States, is partly grows from this lack of a sense of clear narrative.
Yeah, and kind of connecting this kind of question to the previous questions about other colonial societies, do you think America has a particular kind of alienation and social strife, like, say, compared to Canada, like the kind of adjacent country that does have some similarities, like a huge Midwest of flyover states, if you will. Is there a particular kind of alienation and social strife here that you might not find? I mean, you'd find it in some people, but that you might not find across the culture in a place like Canada?
Yeah, I think it's just going to be on a slider, right? Like,
Okay.
if you know, some people feel it more and other people less, but bizarrely in Canada, right, they still have appointed governor generals who I can't really remember what they do, who are appointed by the Queen or something, right? So they still have all these structures, these weird connected structures in the between day-to-day life and England that still go on. And so the English heritage is very powerful still throughout much of Canada in a way that just very directly. I mean, it's not indirect. It's like, oh, pictures of the Queen, British flags, British institutions, British restaurants, the, you know, name brand things that are English, right? It's just really this subtle but continuous reminder of, oh yeah, we're in some way we're related to England. Oh yeah, in some way we're related to England. Oh yeah, in some way we're related to England. And
Yeah.
you get that reminder all the time. The way I think of it, and one example, maybe a silly one, but for me is if you've ever seen the Tibet, and I think a couple other places use the prayer wheels, where you walk by and you spin a wheel that has a prayer written on it, and because it spins, apparently you're announcing the prayer. And I thought, oh, that's great. This is just that physical reminder. You know, click, 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 click. Oh yeah, that's right. I'm a Tibetan Buddhist. Click, 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 click. Oh yeah, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist. Click, 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 click. Right. It's just that very, or the Catholics have the beads, the rosary. Thank you, the rosary, and right. It's just a continuous reminder. Oh yes, I'm part of this Catholic history. I'm part of this narrative. I'm part of this story. Here it is. It's integrated. It's continuous. In the U.S., I think maybe we have credit cards. Maybe that would be our equivalent of the Tibetan prayer wheel and the rosary. Right? That would be probably credit cards. You handle them all the time, and it lets you know who you are and what you're doing.
We have the Super Bowl, so.
And we have the Super Bowl, right. And there's another great example, right? The Super Bowl, greatest football team in the world. We have the NBA championship, was the best basketball team in the world. Major League Baseball is the best baseball team in the world, and we don't even compete against the rest of the world. Right? They're only. It just cracks me up, right? This no pretense that the rest of the world even exists.
World champions.
Yeah, we're the world champions. Although we didn't invite anybody else in the world to compete, it does not matter because, of course, we're still the world champions. Yeah. So that's the kind of distinction I would say. We can say we're world champions and ignore the rest of the world, where in a lot of other, even colonial cultures, there are these continuous reminders, like Catholicism all over South America. Say whatever you want about Spanish conquest and all that, but Catholicism is a significant formative cultural force throughout Central and South America, and that's continuous with a Catholic history that goes back for good and ill, a couple thousand years or whatever, 1,000+ years. So it is quite distinct here.
Great. Well, Wes, thank you so much, and also to the listeners, thank you very much for the questions. These were really good.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate it. It's very helpful. And yeah, keep the questions coming. I enjoy this. It makes me think more. It's always good to think more. So yeah, thanks very much, and we will talk to you later.
All right, take care.